There's a certain kind of silence that only comes in the early morning, the kind that wraps around your bones and makes you listen more closely than you have in years. That was the silence Harold stood in, just beyond the faded lace curtains of his kitchen window. The garden outside hadn't changed much over the decades. The same ivy curled along the fence. The same cracked stones formed a path he'd once walked every day. But something had changed. It wasn't the garden that grew more distant. It was his legs. Where once he could stride across the yard with a mug of coffee in one hand and his thoughts in the other, now even the idea of taking that first step seemed heavier than it used to. Not painful exactly, just slower, more uncertain. And yet, in that quiet moment, with the sun filtering through the trees like it always had, Harold felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity. What if this wasn't just age catching up to him? What if the weariness in his legs, the tremble he noticed when he stood too fast, wasn't some irreversible sentence, but instead a signal, a whisper from the body asking not for surrender, but for attention? He had always believed strength faded with the years, that one day without fanfare, your body simply gave in. But that morning, something resisted that belief. A question took root. What if I've been feeding everything, except the very things that carry me? And that was the moment his story began to change. The question lingered with Harold for days. It nestled quietly in his mind, weaving itself into every step he took, every pause at the staircase, every slow rising from his favorite armchair. And then, almost as if summoned by that very question, he found himself thinking of Linda. Linda, the woman from his book club, who always wore bright scarves and had a laugh that didn't match her thin frame. She had once told the group that walking used to be her meditation. 2 miles each morning, no excuses. But something changed after she turned 70. It started small, just a stiffness in her knees, a longer recovery time after her usual walk. Then came the soreness, the heavy drag in her thighs that no stretching could soothe. She thought, like so many do, well, I've had a good run. This must be what slowing down looks like. But Linda wasn't the type to surrender. She was the type to investigate, so she asked questions. And what she found changed everything. Her doctor, an aging specialist from Boston who had studied muscular degeneration for decades, told her something Harold had never heard before. The enemy isn't always age, it's inflammation. Quiet, chronic, invisible, until one day your muscles stop responding the way they used to. And then, with almost poetic certainty, the doctor added, if muscles are the engines of your body, then omega-3s are the oil that keeps them from seizing. That's when salmon entered the story, not as dinner, but as medicine. 3 times a week, Linda added wild-caught salmon to her meals. Not some fancy dish, just grilled, simple, intentional. Within weeks, the change was undeniable. The soreness faded. Her legs no longer screamed after a walk. They whispered thanks. Her balance returned. And most incredibly, so did her confidence. Science had already backed this up long before Linda ever tried it. In a groundbreaking study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, older adults who regularly consumed omega-3 rich fish showed significant improvement in muscle mass and function without increasing exercise. The omega-3 fatty acids, particularly EPA and DHA, not only reduced systemic inflammation, but actually enhanced muscle protein synthesis, the body's way of rebuilding strength. But it wasn't just the omega-3s. Salmon is also one of the rare natural sources of vitamin D, a nutrient essential for proper muscle contraction and balance. A deficiency, shockingly common in older adults, often goes unnoticed until the falls begin, the stumbles, the silent instability. For Linda, salmon became her quiet revolution, and for Harold, her story lit something inside him. It wasn't just about legs anymore. It was about dignity, about holding on to the freedom to move, not with speed, but with strength. He stared at the old salmon recipe tucked in his cupboard, and for the first time in a long time, he felt not old, but ready. It had been 3 weeks since Harold dusted off the old skillet and gave Salmon a proper home on his dinner plate, and something, though subtle, had shifted. His legs didn't groan as much when he stood. There was a new firmness in his steps, like his body had been waiting for permission to fight back. But as he grew more attuned to his body, he began to notice something else. His legs, though steadier, often felt cold. Not just from the autumn breeze seeping under the door, but from within, like warmth itself was struggling to reach them. Occasionally, when he'd lie in bed at night, a strange cramp would curl around his calf, sharp and sudden, like a warning whispered too late. It reminded him of Robert. Robert had always been the strong one in the neighborhood, the kind of man who carried groceries for widows and chopped firewood just to stay warm. But time had a cruel way of changing the narrative. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Robert had begun to lose his rhythm. He'd pause halfway through the grocery aisle, pretending to check his list when really he just needed to catch his breath. His legs felt heavy, not from weight, but from something deeper, like life itself was slowing down in his veins. At first he shrugged it off. "Just age," he said. "Nothing I haven't earned." But the day he stumbled stepping off the curb, with no one around to help him up, Robert realized this wasn't just aging, it was a quiet emergency. When he finally spoke with his doctor, he learned something most people never hear in time. Your blood is your river of life. If it slows down, everything downstream suffers, especially your legs. Poor circulation, they told him, was stealing the vitality from his limbs, drop by drop. The cause wasn't a disease, but a deficiency. His blood vessels, once elastic and generous, had begun to stiffen, narrowing the path between his heart and his feet. The prescription? Not a pill, not a surgery, just spinach. That unassuming leaf, so often pushed aside on dinner plates, held within it a miracle. Not in the form of hype, but in nitrates, natural compounds that convert into nitric oxide, a molecule that opens up blood vessels like a key unlocking a door. With each widened vessel, more oxygen flowed, more nutrients arrived. Muscles that had been gasping for life finally breathed again. And spinach didn't come alone. It brought with it magnesium, a mineral as quiet as it is powerful, essential for muscle relaxation and contraction. Without enough of it, spasms arise, stiffness takes root, and your legs, once strong and responsive, begin to feel like strangers you no longer trust. Robert made a vow. Every morning, a handful of spinach in his eggs. Every evening, a salad rich with green. Not as an obligation, but as a rescue mission, for his legs and for the life they still had left to carry. And sure enough, the change came. His grocery trips stretched longer, not because he was slower, but because he didn't need to stop. His legs felt lighter, warmer. The cramps disappeared. It wasn't youth he'd regained. It was flow. Back in his own kitchen, Harold stood quietly, holding a single leaf of spinach between his fingers. It was soft, almost fragile, and yet within it was something ancient. Something powerful enough to stir the rivers inside him back to life. He didn't say anything. He just placed it gently on the cutting board and kept going. The first time Harold lost his balance getting out of bed, it felt like nothing. A small misstep, the kind anyone could make. But the second time, when he had to grab the edge of the nightstand to steady himself, a thought crept in that he didn't dare say out loud. What if my legs are forgetting how to hold me? It was a quiet fear, not the kind that screams, but the kind that lingers, especially when you're alone. especially when the floor feels just a little farther away than it used to. That fear brought Harold back to another man he hadn't seen in years. Jerry. Jerry had once been a builder, not just of houses, but of memories. His hands had shaped beams, poured foundations, and painted dreams into walls. But at 80, Jerry's world had narrowed, from construction sites to quiet walks around the block. And even those had begun to slip away. It started, as it often does, with subtlety. He couldn't quite explain the fatigue in his thighs. His legs trembled just enough to make him second-guess standing too quickly, and though nothing was broken, nothing bruised, he began to feel unsure. He thought it was just age, that the body, like wood, simply settles over time. But then a soft-spoken nutritionist in his retirement community looked over his diet and said something that stopped him cold. Your body isn't breaking down, it's starving, quietly, invisibly, for what it can no longer absorb. Jerry had been eating less meat, less variety, less everything. Not out of choice, but habit. His appetite had shrunk, but so had his strength. That's when he was introduced to something deceptively simple. A cup of Greek yogurt. It didn't come in a prescription bottle. It didn't promise miracles. It just fit into his mornings, into his life, into the spaces where muscle memory was beginning to fade. What Jerry didn't know, what most people don't, is that as we age, our muscles become less responsive to protein. We need more of it, and we need it in a form our bodies can actually use. Greek yogurt delivers exactly that. Dense, bioavailable protein, rich in leucine, the amino acid that signals muscle repair. But it wasn't just the protein. Inside that creamy spoonful were quiet guardians. Calcium to keep his bones strong enough to carry him. Vitamin D to help muscles contract without faltering. Probiotics to heal the gut, because without a healthy gut, even the best nutrients are lost in translation. Jerry didn't notice the change overnight, but weeks later he realized something strange. He was rising from bed without the sway. The tremble was gone. His legs no longer hesitated. It wasn't strength like he had at 40, but it was trust. Trust that his body would meet him halfway. And that trust, Harold now knew, was everything. Standing in his kitchen one morning, Harold opened the fridge. There it was, a plain cup of Greek yogurt, smooth, silent, humble. But in his eyes, it was more than a snack. It was an anchor, a quiet promise. You are not done yet. And as the light from the window spilled across the counter, Harold smiled. Not because he felt young again, but because he finally understood what it meant to feel held. By the end of that month, Harold's kitchen looked different, not in appearance, but in intention. The salmon wasn't just fish anymore. It was strength. The spinach wasn't a garnish. It was circulation. The yogurt, resting quietly on the shelf, had become trust. And yet, something still felt unfinished. His legs, though steadier, still lacked something. Not quite power, but endurance. That quiet fuel that used to carry him through an entire day without pause. That once let him lose track of time pruning the garden or strolling down memory-filled roads. Now, even after progress, he'd feel the fatigue settle in by noon, as though his body ran out of breath before his heart did. That final piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly through a phone call. It was Susan, his sister-in-law, once known for her boundless energy and the way she could turn a wild, tangled yard into a blooming paradise with nothing but a trowel in her hands. But in recent years, she had slowed, visibly. She told Harold that gardening had become more resting than planting. She'd sit in her chair, watching the weeds grow faster than her hands could keep up. She missed the dirt, the sun on her neck, the satisfying ache after a long day tending to life. I thought it was just me, she whispered, like I was quietly fading into the soil. But her granddaughter, a young, bright-eyed dietitian, had another idea. She had looked at Susan's plate and said, without judgment but with conviction, "You're not feeding your fire, Grandma. You're snacking on sparks, but what your body needs is embers." And so, she gave her a root. Not a rare supplement, not a powdered promise, just sweet potatoes. Software, earthy, ancient, but behind their humble skin, sweet potatoes hold the one thing older muscles crave but rarely receive: steady energy. Unlike sugar-laced snacks or refined carbs that flood the bloodstream with a rush, then leave you empty, sweet potatoes release energy slowly, sustaining every movement, every breath, every step with quiet resilience. They are rich in complex carbohydrates, the kind that feed muscles instead of spiking blood sugar, and within them lies a powerful friend, potassium, a mineral essential for preventing cramps, aiding contraction, and restoring what exertion quietly depletes. Susan began roasting them twice a week. Olive oil, a dash of cinnamon, no fanfare, and slowly the shift returned. Her hands dug back into the earth. Her pauses between planting grew shorter. She began finishing tasks again, not just physically, but with joy. And most of all, she smiled while standing. That was what Harold remembered most. The thought of Susan, laughing in her garden boots, mud on her knees, sweat on her brow, and life blooming not just from the soil, but from inside her. He looked at the sweet potatoes on his counter, their rough skins hiding the warmth within. He peeled them slowly, reverently, as though uncovering a secret passed down from root to soul. Because now he knew, strength isn't just what lifts you. Endurance isn't just what carries you. Together, they're what lets you live fully, even when the world thinks you're supposed to slow down. Harold's plate that evening wasn't fancy. Just roasted sweet potatoes, spinach sautéed with garlic, a slice of grilled salmon, and a side of Greek yogurt with honey and walnuts. But to him, it was more than dinner. It was a declaration, a promise to his legs, to his life, that he wasn't done walking, not yet. That night, as Harold sat at his table, warm light casting soft shadows across the wood, he looked down at the meal before him, not with hunger, but with reverence. Every bite held a memory, every flavor, a story. Every color on that plate was a small rebellion against the quiet fading he once believed was inevitable. And as he lifted his fork, he wasn't just feeding his body. He was feeding the part of himself that still believed in walking without fear, in rising without hesitation, in living without apology. Because here's the truth no one tells you loud enough. Aging doesn't mean disappearing. It doesn't mean fading into stillness or accepting fragility as fate. Sometimes what we call weakness is just the body's quiet request to be nourished differently. Not harder, not louder, just wiser. You don't need to run a marathon. You don't need to climb mountains. But you do deserve to feel steady on your own 2 feet, to trust your legs the way you once did without thinking. And it all begins with the simple, sacred act of choosing differently at the table. So if your legs have been whispering lately, if they've grown tired or slow or unsure, don't ignore them. Listen, feed them, trust them, walk with them, not just as limbs, but as companions that have carried you through every chapter of your life, because they're not giving up on you. They're just waiting for you to return the favor.